By way of introduction, I'm Will Seath. I am a regular contributor to Fair Forward and wrote the piece about Hyattsville. And I'm also locally a design architect with McCreary Architects, which just happened to coincidentally to have been commissioned to design the renovations for St. Dominic's here. So it's really a pleasure to be here at the parish hosting this event. Chris Currie is a native of Detroit. He came to the D.C. Metro about 30 years ago, right?
Yeah, even more.
Yeah, even more than that, and has been a resident of Hyattsville since 1997. Is that correct? Yeah, served several years as a city councilman in Hyattsville, and has been instrumental in the growth and vitality of that community, not just the parish community there, but the community as a whole. So everyone, please welcome Chris Currie. Chris, when you and I first met a little over 6 months ago, and we walked around the neighborhood in Hyattsville, we found out we had sort of a common background, even though we're only we're a generation apart from each other. We're both from Rust Belt cities. We both grew up in ethnic Catholic parishes that had a very strong identity. And both of those places, yours in Detroit, mine in Pittsburgh, have sort of fallen on hard times, and those communities have been lost in one way or another. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your upbringing in Detroit, the loss of your parish community, and how that has affected your mindset as an adult and your work moving forward.
Sure, thanks, Will. I found as I've gone on in years now that I run into people like you who have this background in the last vestiges of urban Catholicism in this country, where you had these sort of ghetto parishes, where the parish really was the center of a community, a walkable community, and then you know, as we've left them, we felt this sense of being bereft, of missing something. You know, even as a child of 10, leaving for the suburbs where we were 7 miles away from our church, we drove, there was no school, and really almost nothing happened at the church except for the sacraments, which of course are absolutely critical for Catholics, but compared to experience of being in a parish where really everything, the whole social and family life of the community was centered at the church, and not just the school, but you had all the fraternal organizations, you had the scouts, you had all the feasts and the dances, and of course the big life events of weddings. If weddings were gigantic, you know, everybody came. You know, you had these giant wedding halls for receptions after the mass, and then going to the suburban model where you just went to church, and then the people you lived with very often weren't members of the church, and you didn't really do much at the church except for go to mass. So that, as a child, helped to form my sense of what I wanted later in life. And for many years, I didn't really pursue it actively. But after, in fact, for 11 years, I was a member of this parish here, St. Dominic's. I lived a few blocks away in a rental townhouse with a few other Catholic guys. And as I remarked to Will, I didn't even know these rooms were down here. I wasn't that involved in the parish or the community. So going to Hyattsville, I kind of fell into something different that began to be a vision for trying to recreate what I thought was a more organic parish community.
Yeah, just for the benefit of anyone who may not have read the article, maybe you could give a recount of how you came to D.C. and how you wound up in Hyattsville.
Sure. I came here to go to school at Georgetown, and then ended up hanging around afterwards. Left a couple of times, once to spend a year with the Dominicans in the novitiate, where they wisely decided I was not cut out for that vocation. And kept getting pulled back to Washington, mostly because of work. I was in the nonprofit sector where there are so many jobs here. Then eventually met Susie, my wife, who's here in the first row, and for a number of years she resisted my charms, but eventually she kind of ran out of other guys. So she consented to get married, and we originally planned to be married here, but the church was being renovated for the first time, and the pastor suggested we marry somewhere else, so we ended up getting married at St. Aloysius. And then we bought a house in Hyattsville, basically, because my wife was a travel editor at the time and was visiting an inn out in the Eastern Shore, and the owner, chatting with her when she found out she was engaged, asked where she was thinking about living, and then ended up talking about Hyattsville as a place where they had come from, and talked about the charming historic homes and its proximity to D.C. and the low prices and the nice community feel. So she called me that evening, and I ended up driving out to Hyattsville at night, and fortunately kind of dropped into the historic district and liked the look of the houses. And then we went on a period of several months of research and discernment, and finally bought the house in Hyattsville. I was still working downtown. My wife was working as an editor at the Washington Times at that point, and so it was convenient for us. And after coming to Hyattsville, we loved our house. It's a 1905 Victorian house. We didn't necessarily think everything about the city was optimal at that point. Especially my wife was acutely aware of some of the deficiencies. It was disinvestment from the suburban period where people moved further and further away. Hyattsville was a very early streetcar suburb, and after World War II, people started moving further and further away from the city. As the city lost people and businesses and so on, a blight started to occur. A lot of the amenities were lost. And so I decided at some point that maybe I should try to do something about that. So I ended up running for city council about a year and a half after we had moved here. And won the election, and that started an 8-year process of civic engagement where we tried to sort of turn the ship around a little bit in Hyattsville, and it was hard, and every status quo has its stakeholders, and so it was difficult, but we were able to make common cause with other mostly younger, newer residents who had a vision for the city that was similar to ours, and then we were able to eventually attract more investment, redevelopment, upgrade some of the standards for development and services and so on in the city, redo the infrastructure and attract some major investments. So about $2 billion of investment later, the city looks a lot different than it did. And there's a lot of younger people who've come, a lot of newer people. Most of them are not Catholic like we are, but often they're looking for some of the similar things that we are looking for, which is a sense of community, a sense of a neighborhood. Hyattsville just happened to, and I could sense this right away, is that Hyattsville had some of those ingredients that make for an organic community. The way it was developed in the 19th century and the early 20th century, before the age of the suburb. And so you had a commercial district, and you had the churches and the parks and the homes and the front porches and the sidewalks, and everything was walkable. Right. So we could see that there was basically a great infrastructure in place, just had to be renewed.
Right. Yeah, you described it as a streetcar suburb, which is the perfect term for it, in contrast with conventional modern suburbia, that it's not possible to walk from place to place. The layout of the streets is very different, but at the same time, it's not, when most people think of urbanism, they think of density, they think of Manhattan, they think even of a place like Washington, D.C., but this was a place that was urban, though not necessarily dense, but had those that character of community, walkability, mixed use. Like you said, there was a main street that had businesses and industries and residences scattered throughout the neighborhood. It wasn't zoned in the way that modern cities and modern planned towns tend to be. You've described a little bit of what you did as a city councilman, as somebody in an elected position, but you're also living there as a private citizen, and you got involved in some work there as well to help build the community. Why don't you tell the audience a little about that?
Sure. We got involved in the parish, of course. St. Jerome is the parish in Hyattsville, and it's a nice little parish. It has a long history. It was actually founded the same month as the city of Hyattsville, in October of 1886. And the history of the parish coincides with the history of the community. At one point, it became a very, very large parish. Right after World War II, a lot of the Catholic population that was concentrated in northeast Washington ended up moving out towards Hyattsville. And by the 1950s, St. Jerome had grown to a very, very large parish. It was the only parish really in the area, and we had a very high concentration of large Catholic families. So when the new church was built, the third church at St. Jerome, which is the current parish, was built in the 1950s. It was a gigantic facility. It held, I think it may be the largest geographical parish church. And there was a big school, and those facilities were still there, but the parish had shrunk a lot as the children of that initial generation of blue-collar Catholics had grown up and often gone on to college, and then followed that migration out to the further suburbs. The parish shrunk at the same time. Other parishes had been carved out of the old St. Jerome, so we got there. There was a sense of this sort of this vast physical plant and not a very large community left inside of it. Most of the students at the school were not from the neighborhood. They commuted in from other places. And indeed, the enrollment began to drop soon after we got there. It used to be a very, very large school with over 500 students. It shrunk down to about half that size. So we started telling some of our friends about the community that we had found. At that point, they were looking for, a lot of them had young families, and so they were looking to locate maybe in their first home. Maybe they'd been renting. And we started inviting people out to look at the community. In those early years, not too many people were takers because, things were a little long in the tooth, and there wasn't a lot of the young Catholic families that we have now. But there were some pioneers that ended up coming out, and my sister and her family came out. They have 8 kids now, and our friends Rebecca and Dennis Teddy came out early, and I see Chris McMains is here, and he actually grew up in the area and ended up going out to Las Vegas and coming back, and then buying a home in Hyattsville, and so gradually we started to see this sort of germinal community developing at St. Jerome. And I think what made it a little bit different than perhaps the experience of other parishes is that because of the type of community Hyattsville is, the way that these families interacted with each other was a little bit it was a little bit more comprehensive than what you would have at a typical suburban parish. People didn't just see each other at Mass because they lived in the same neighborhood within, a few blocks of each other often. They got to know each other and spend time with each other. They started to develop activities to help nurture their faith and also just to meet other human needs that were in the neighborhood, not necessarily even at church. And so gradually there became this whole sort of, organic framework of community life. It wasn't planned. It just sort of happened. It was supported by a vision, I think, but it wasn't supported by an organization. There were no articles of incorporation or no leadership, because basically we believed that the parish was the center of the community. Not everybody in the community belongs to the parish, but it is sort of the center of the community, and so it grew up along with the life of the parish. And you see now that a lot of these younger families are helping support a lot of the ministries of the parish and the school. And actually, as your article pointed out, a lot of them had a lot to do with the transformation of the school, and now it's become sort of a model school that's being emulated across the country.
Right. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that history of the school. You already mentioned the enrollment was down by the time you'd gotten there to half of its historic high, and eventually the Archdiocese had put St. Jerome's on a list potentially to be closed. The community wanted to save the parish school, and tell us more about that.
Yes, the school probably would have closed without some serious intervention, and the Archdiocese was calling for that. That's what the process was about. There were 13 schools put on the list of consultation that year, the most ever. And what happened was the parish and the school got together, and we raised a lot of money to keep the doors open. But meanwhile, some of the members of the intentional community, as we call it, approached the pastor and the principal and said, "Well, we really would like to, help save the school, but we want the school truly to be worth saving." And what ended up happening was they created a committee of 8 of those individuals who had special expertise in the classical method of education. Everybody from professors to homeschool curriculum development experts and so on, and they were commissioned to go ahead and try to move St. Jerome to a classical model. Turned out that when they looked into it, there were no existing curricula for Catholic classical schools, surprisingly, because that used to be what all Catholic schools were. But so they ended up having to write their own, which they did over the period of a year, meeting weekly as a group and then in pairs during the week, off until like 2 or 3 in the morning, because they had other things to do during the day. But they created a very beautiful 135-page curriculum, which is freely downloadable on our website, and has now been implemented also in other schools.
The D.C. metro area is one of the most expensive places to live in the nation. And when you're building a community that naturally appeals to families, and sometimes large Catholic families, how do you make it a sustainable place for families to remain, to grow, to set down roots, and for more families to continue to come in and to keep it affordable and to maintain that community across a spectrum of economic classes as well?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, and there's no magic bullet sort of answer to it. I would say this is that what helps is to have a community where you're not at the higher end of the price spectrum, that you're more towards the lower end. Hyattsville is still, for an inside the Beltway community, relatively affordable. It's not dirt cheap like it was when we first moved, but it's still less expensive than areas in Montgomery or Fairfax, Arlington, and so on. And it's likely to stay that way because of the perception of the public school system. And that gives an advantage to Catholic families because most of them are not interested in the public school system. So there are more families willing to pay more relatively to live in Hyattsville who are Catholic than those who are looking more for public schools. On the other hand, the disadvantage that we find is that there are also a higher percentage of Catholic families that are single income than in the Washington metro area. Washington metro area has the highest percentage of 2-income families in the country, last I heard. And so that, of course, drives prices up as well. And so those families who don't have 2 full-time incomes, it's more challenging. And we saw just prior to the real estate bust several years ago, when prices had risen quite a bit, that we were starting to see a shrinking in the Catholic demographic that was looking at Hyatt. So we were seeing lawyers and lobbyists, but we're not seeing some of the other folks. We've seen more lawyers and lobbyists because they were looking for places that were more affordable relative to the ridiculous prices that were in other areas. But other than that group, less of other groups. Then the recession kind of made things a little more affordable again for a while, and now they're starting to come back up again. So that is a challenge, and we've been thinking about it, and there's people who propose different solutions, but it means basically that you have to be a little bit creative. You have to find people who are willing to be able to work out creative solutions for income, and also for living. Maybe you don't live as big a house as you might have anticipated living in. What a lot of folks find is that when you live in a more urban community, you don't necessarily have to have all the square footage because your world really kind of shrinks in the suburbs. It becomes your abode, your little villa. It's all that square footage inside and outside the house, but you don't really have as much shared space with people around you. Whereas in a place like Hyattsville, like coming here, I thought we were gonna be late because we had to shoo 12 boys away from the house, and they were all going to figure out where they're all going. But people are always flowing back and forth, and when that happens, you don't have as much need for lots and lots of space inside. So it's something we're going to be, journeying along with as we continue to see prices go up. I'm not sure if there's any way we can fully answer that question.
Yeah. Well, and at the same time, much of the housing market doesn't automatically look for the kind of houses that are in Hyattsville, the older houses that aren't necessarily open floor plans or that don't have dedicated rooms for a home office or for a den or a library or what have you. They were more flexible spaces, but smaller. And so it seems like part of the appeal of Hyattsville requires a willingness to live differently than what is commonly expected in our contemporary culture.
Correct. There's a lot that's different. And I think you find that when people come to Hyattsville, they come with the same shared experiences of others, in our society today. We're raised as suburbanites. That's the experience most Gen Xers and millennials have. And the difference is the millennials are starting to reject that model, and they're wanting to live a more urban existence. But still, they don't have a lived experience of that kind of community life, and they don't necessarily know that they want it. In some aspects of it might be a little scary to them. They don't want to be so close to other people, especially people who are not like themselves. Hyattsville is a very diverse community, socioeconomically, ethnically, racially, and for a typical suburban young adult who hasn't experienced that, it can be a little bit off-putting at first. So it does take a little bit of living it to understand, oh, this is what's so good about it. And then once you do, you don't want to leave, And I think what we found is that the only folks who leave are those who are here temporarily to begin with because they're getting a PhD, and then they have to go off to wherever their job takes them. And then they take that experience with them, and hopefully a lot of them are starting community activities where they end up. But a lot of us sort of lifers, we're pretty committed.
At the same time, you've said all along, Hyattsville has never been an exclusively Catholic community. The intentional community of Catholics is a strong one, but it's certainly not the majority in Hyattsville. And as you have people from other traditions or no tradition whatsoever, just completely secular people in Hyattsville, it seems like that's also an opportunity for the community in an evangelical capacity.
It definitely is, and I think that's one of the valuable aspects of having an urban community that you often can't get when you get far out into the suburbs. It can be challenging because, of course, one of the things that people like about the intentional community is that it's so nurturing, and you like the fact that your kids are playing with kids whose parents are giving them the same value system and so on. But at the same time, you're also living shoulder to shoulder with people who don't have that experience. And I think it's been good for both groups. I mean, I think, in Hyattsville, I think Catholics are more tolerated than they would be, say, in Tacoma Park, which is only a couple of miles away. I remember making friends with a family from Tacoma Park early on, and they were just, we don't ever talk about our religion there because, it would be such a scandalous thing. Here, Catholics are visible, and we're involved in different ways in the community. And as a result, people don't think of us as being green-eyed monsters, as sometimes I think in many inner Beltway communities in Washington, I think Catholics are looked upon that way. But it does mean you have to make a deliberate effort as well to really reach out to your neighbors and not be insular, because you can be insular even in a urban community too, if you choose to be. You just have a choice not to be.
Right. How do you think the parish community would be different if the form of the urban form of Hyattsville were different? If it were more like a conventional suburb, what would be lacking, or conversely, what do you think might be gained by the urban form being less traditional in a parish?
I'm sorry, the last part of that question lost me.
That's all right. I guess what I'm getting at is, what do you think the urbanism of Hyattsville, the traditional small town character of Hyattsville, adds to the parish community that wouldn't be the case in a more conventional modern suburb?
Well, again, I think it's mostly that we're not relating to each other just at church, we're living with each other, because I think that ultimately that's sort of what was envisioned in certainly in the Acts of the Apostles, the early Christian communities. I mean, they were people who lived a communal life. The body of Christ wasn't just something that was a theological abstraction. It was people living face to face and shoulder to shoulder, day in and day out. And so when you are living that way, then your faith takes on a more three-dimensional form. It makes it not only possible to have more of the sorts of ministries that might be typical, but it means you're able to minister in ways that you might not find it easy to minister in a traditional suburban parish. And your article mentions one of them towards the end, where the community came together around a tragic funeral of a child. It's something that's really, really important. That's easy to miss, and that's why I'm always reluctant to just give a oh yeah, you can do Catholic community anywhere. Well, you can to some extent, and we can't do it perfectly in Hyattsville either. But I think it is important, if you really want to have an organic Catholic community, to find a community that has the essential ingredients to be able to live that way. You just can't do that in a typical suburb, I don't think.
Sure.